Dear President Whittle, during your one term, as I said at the Freedom Rally, Ted Cruz was, I think the Republican Party ought to say that we are the party of no reelection to the same office. We are one-term people. I'll make that case later. But during your one term, what will you do with NASA? As you know, President Obama has made Muslim outreach the primary mission of NASA. Under your administration, will NASA be restored to its proper role and become something America can be proud of again? Will you push for a return to the moon? Will NERVA return? That's a lovely question. It's a great question. First of all, we don't fly space shuttles anymore, but I don't think NASA's budget has decreased significantly. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? It's certainly not decreased substantially. We were launching airplanes the size of 737s into space, and now we're not, and we're still spending as much money on NASA. What does NASA do anymore? Look, NASA is a government program. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, I've said this before, I need to say it again, needs to be completely clear. During my youth and my adolescence, I had a tattoo of the NASA vector on my heart, under my skin. NASA was everything to me. NASA was NASA. NASA was everything that I liked. It was everything that I admired about everything was encapsulated in that blue logo with the stars and the red vector. Every time I saw the NASA vector, I thought, that's what we should be. That's everything. NASA, definitely can NASA get us to the moon? NASA did get us to the moon. NASA was responsible for the controllers. NASA was responsible for many of the engineers, but and training the astronauts and all that other stuff. But remember, the hardware was made by private companies, and North American primarily was a contractor for the command module and service module, and Grumman was a prime contractor for the lunar module. But NASA was, at the time, a terrific success because it was given a specific task and a deadline, a time limit and a deadline, and it worked wonders. But once you lost Apollo, you began to say, well, where do we go now? And without a mission and without a goal, NASA suffered the same thing that the Walt Disney Company did. It suffered from no longer having a vision and a goal and an objective. It went to being a sort of a self-perpetuating thing. It's a shareholder thing now. It's we've got a budget, and we have to figure out what we're going to do with it. So we have a space shuttle whose purpose was to reach the space station, and the space station whose purpose it was to have a place for the shuttle to go. I knew NASA, I've had many conversations, not going to repeat them now, about the changes in NASA between Apollo 13 and the known potential for failure that destroyed both Challenger and Columbia. They knew that there was burn through on those SRBs, and they knew that foam was coming off the tanks on the Challenger and the Columbia disasters. But what really is just so appalling about it is NASA just didn't know where it was going or what it was doing. And so they began to get into this mode that they're in now, where it's like the first thing that we can't do is have any failures, and you can't lead that. So you can't restore that. It's gone. It's not what it used to be. So in answer to your question, Mike, if I was the president, I can tell you precisely what I would do with NASA. I would still give NASA significant funding. I would utterly get NASA out of the space transportation business. NASA would be something like the FAA, with some exceptions. But NASA's mission right now is to make sure the private enterprise, don't get into space. I would make NASA's mission facilitating private companies' access to space, facilitating, by easing of regulations, by running interference, by helping with with local codes. Would not be NASA's job to keep people out of space. It would be NASA's job to allow private enterprise to get into space and make it as easy as they could. There is a role for NASA in terms of unmanned exploration, I think, that NASA does very well still to this day. And I think there's certainly a role for NASA in terms of research and development, where NASA should be given a budget to work on pure research, things like, Vasimir drives and, radiation shielding and that kind of thing. But I would not put NASA in operational charge of I certainly wouldn't make them the gatekeepers to getting into space. I would, in fact, make them the people who are designed to not keep the gate closed, but make sure there is no gate. I would make NASA fundamentally restructured as a research organization, a organization that was designed to make private enterprise as easy as possible to get into space, as with the FAA, which I think is to some degree overregulated, quite a bit overregulated. But the FAA certainly does serve certain valuable functions. I would have NASA have some sort of authority with some fundamental safety issues, but nothing like what we're seeing here. When I say fundamental safety issues, I mean NASA would have an obligation. There is an obligation on the part of the government to protect the citizenship. So I'd make sure that that the people who are talking about going into space, and that should be anybody, the fundamental precautions were taken care of to make sure that the general public was not exposed to any excessive dangers. Absolutely would relight NERVA. And I would put NASA back in a position of being a facilitator rather than a controller. The federal government doesn't run the airlines. If it did, we would have Aeroflot. The Soviet Union had a state airline called Aeroflot, and they measured their delays not in hours but in days. This flight is 3 days late. Maybe. Might be longer. It's been well said by many people that if the FAA existed during the golden age of aviation and the FAA had gotten involved in regulation at a time when we were learning how to build commercial aviation, then today we would have the official FAA national airplane, and it would be made out of wood, and it would have propellers, 4 propellers, and it would travel at 8,000 feet in the weather. At 200 miles an hour, it would carry 30 passengers from Los Angeles to New York in 35 hours, and the flight would cost $8,000 per seat. That's what would happen if the FAA had been there in the golden age of aviation. We need to get NASA out of the way. Out of the way. There's some things it can do. I'd keep unmanned exploration, and I'd give them a budget for that. The work NASA's done with Cassini, Galileo, Opportunity and Spirit rovers, Curiosity rovers, the Mars missions, extraordinary. I would take their manned space money and put that into unmanned exploration and research. I might provide some limited numbers of I certainly would provide tax breaks. Let's put it that way. I like that so much better than grants. I would provide large tax incentives to companies that wanted to get into space. I would declare that that a presence in space and that mastery of aerospace technologies in the United States' national interest and in the vital interest of our future as a country, not only in terms of defense but in terms of our economy. And I would have the Internal Revenue Service provide enormously attractive tax breaks for companies that wanted to get into space. That's how I would do it. Rather than taking your money by gunpoint out of your pocket and giving it to some company and hoping they can succeed, I would make it in other people's interest to invest in that company because of the tax breaks. So that's what I would do if I were in charge of NASA, Mike.